when you're thinking words like always, never, right there, that's a story that you are telling yourself. Because I promise you can find evidence to the contrary. Our brains want to just keep our life easy and keep things easy. So we're adept at finding patterns in things. Whether we do it consciously or subconsciously, our brains are like, ooh, there's a pattern. And then when you go to try to break that pattern, your brain is like, woohoo, no, we're not doing that today. Welcome back to Unapologetic Rabble Rousers. I am Doc Shelley.
And I'm Carla. We're wrapping up our session that the last few episodes have been about leaning in.
Leaning in.
And so this is going to be our wrap up of that, where we want to cover off a little bit of what we've already talked about, but we also want to be able to provide some practical thoughts and tips about really taking this seriously.
Yes.
So let's do that.
Let's do that.
Okay, so when we talked across all of these episodes, and you may have noticed, those who have been following, that we went straight through the conversation. We don't normally have an episode that runs for 3 episodes worth. But we got on such a roll talking about it. It was, no, we can't stop this. We're going to keep on going. Because this is so important. It is so prevalent as a skill and also something that we don't practice really well.
And it's such a good, prolific skill to have because it makes, well, one, it just makes your life easier. But it makes relationships better and it makes conversations more productive. And it helps you get the results you're looking for.
I think the things that we covered off, there were 5 top topic areas.
Top topic areas?
Top topics, yes. And quickly we ran through these. We talked about patterns. We talked about triggers, expectations, assumptions, and
reflection. Did
you
say reflection?
I don't know. I may have. I wasn't listening. Just kidding. Okay. So let's spend some time on those. Why those things were important. Why don't we start with assumptions?
You know what they say about assumptions.
Yes. Yes.
Assumptions are, I have a love-hate relationship with assumptions, right? Because our brains want to make assumptions quickly for that whole flight or fight reaction that we tend to have. And our ancestors living off the land, that was a good thing to have. You saw wild animals coming at you, you want to fight or flight. And so those quick assumptions that we tend to make were sometimes for self-preservation. And I think now we get into these assumptions and sometimes people just hold so true to that assumption that they 1000% believe it must be true. And it's hard to let go of assumptions sometimes. You think about that, what is that saying? The first time you meet somebody, first impressions, you never get past a first impression.
Yes.
You can say the same thing with assumptions.
I agree. And that also speaks to patterns, which then leads to expectations. Those two seem to be really tightly wound together.
Yeah, patterns, our brains want to just keep our life easy and keep things easy. So we're adept at finding patterns in things. Whether we do it consciously or subconsciously, our brains are like, ooh, there's a pattern. And then when you go to try to break that pattern, your brain is like, woohoo, no, we're not doing that today. So it's interesting as I think about, just for myself, building different habits and new habits and how much I have to talk back to my habit brain to say, no, we're not doing that today. We're going to do this differently today. So it's really interesting that as we develop patterns, it's hard to break those patterns because they become habits. Habits are hard to break.
That then also leads into the notion about expectations, because when we see a pattern repeated, or more importantly, when we become tuned enough to see the pattern in everything, There's this notion that everything becomes a fit to that pattern, but it's because we're not paying attention to the things that say no, it's not a part of that pattern. We just dismiss that. In fact, we talked about that. The friend you had that was, or have, that was going to test her friends.
Yes.
Okay? She completely interrupted this pattern, but she did it consciously trying to test if anybody else would pick up on it, which was just an interesting approach.
Yeah, it was a strange approach to test a whole set of friends without ever having a conversation about it. But you think about how many times, and I've even thought this myself, well, I wonder why she hasn't called me in so long. Well, my fingers are not broke. I can punch the digits on my phone, or I can say, "Hey Siri, call so and so." Don't do it, Siri. But how many times do we just get locked into that? She usually calls me, or he usually calls me, and I hear it all the time from people.
Yes.
Well, that person, my sister hasn't called. I don't have a sister, but my sister hasn't called me in 2 weeks, and I'm really ticked off about it. Okay. Can you call your sister? No, she calls me. Okay.
So
you're gonna craft some stories. You're gonna make some assumptions because the pattern was broken.
Yeah, it doesn't work. It's not doing the same thing it used to.
I speak English as my native language, and so when that pattern breaks, our minds will craft a fast story and make some assumptions and spin out of control unless we consciously stop it and think, I can do something about this. I could do something differently. I could make that phone call. I could have that conversation. I could do whatever.
You think about that. How often do you find yourself caught up in a story that's based on some assumptions you've made that you picked up from some patterns that none of this has been calibrated? It's what you are familiar with and comfortable with. Even if you don't like it, it's something that you know. And then we get wrapped up in those stories, and the stories are what then drive us into the directions or away from the actions that we would take if we were being a little bit more conscientious.
There's a woman in this group that I belong to who had shared the other day that it was her birthday, and she told her husband what she wanted. She gave him a picture of a handbag that she wanted, and she gave him a picture of something else that she wanted. I don't remember what it was. And he always shops at the last minute. He never gets her what she wants. These are the stories that she's told herself. So he shopped the night before her birthday, and it was a few minutes before the store closed, and he didn't get the exact handbag that she wanted or the exact other thing that she wanted, a book. He got one word wrong on the title, so the book was different. And she just went on and on and on about how this proves that he does not love her, he does not care about her, because he always does this.
Wow.
And we were all like, whoa. Like, first of all, he got you something. And one of my friends said, if it's that important to you that he gets you exactly what you want, why don't you just buy it yourself and have him wrap it? And she said, no, that's not how we do it around here. So you would rather hold on to that story that my husband always gets me the wrong birthday present and he always shops at the last minute than changing the pattern. You just want to hold on to that story. It's amazing to me how many people will fight for the story rather than looking at some alternatives.
That is so key. So the story becomes more important than breaking the pattern, than challenging what are the assumptions and expectations.
Yeah.
Holding on to that story. It's kind of like Linus in his blanket.
Exactly.
So think about the stories that you may hear running through your mind as you're engaging with some behavior, some pattern that has been interrupted. Back to pattern interruptus.
Yeah, and when you're thinking words like always, never, right there, that's a story that you are telling yourself. Because I promise you can find evidence to the contrary. If you're always and nevering something, you can find some evidence to the contrary. That is a story.
So, friends, there you have a really important insight into yourself about if you have a never or always situation, it's time to check the story. And if you look not too very hard, you can probably find evidence to the contrary. Evidence that says, well, the story may be comfortable, but it's not accurate.
I think that's key. The story's comfortable. That's why we keep holding on to it.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's serving you in some way.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting something out of that story. But what might you get if you change the story?
At least test it. So you can go ahead, you can take your steps forward knowing that the story is absolutely, that's another one, absolutely always never. Test the story. Want to know whether or not the story really is serving you and not just being comfortable. Because even if it's uncomfortable, if you know it, it's a comfort.
Yeah.
If you know it, it doesn't represent a change to how you have to approach something or think about something or be, then even when it's uncomfortable, there's comfort in it. So you got to step outside of your comfort zone sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Get comfortable being uncomfortable.
And this is about collecting other evidence. It's about caring enough to want to go and collect other evidence. You need to look inward to find out what is, like you just said, why do I think this story is serving me so well? What is it? What is it that if this story wasn't true, how would things be different?
Oh, I like that question.
Yes. Yeah. I think I borrowed that from Byron Katie. Yeah.
A good source.
Doing the work. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So let's talk about leaning in, being in conversation, and what are some of the thoughts that we would want to share about doing that?
Yeah, I think for leaning in, you have to really know your motivation in going into a conversation. What's your intent? Am I going in to compel you to my point of view? Am I trying to persuade you? Because if that's the case, that may not be a great way to approach conversation. I said it in an earlier podcast. You really want to think about when you're entering into a conversation, what's that first 30 seconds going to look like? Because that will pretty much dictate the results you get out of that conversation. So you want to spend a minute and think about, what's my intent of having this conversation? What do I want out of it? And not just what do I want for myself, but what do I want for the other person or the other people? And you might even have to think bigger. If it's a family conversation, what do I want for this person? What do I want for the family? Mm-hmm. What do I want for all of us? And if it's in an organization, it's me, what do I want for me and this person and for the organization? So you may have to take it up to a higher level. So
I want to interject here that when you're having a conversation, there are two parties involved, at least. There's you and whoever else. If I'm instigating the conversation, what you've just talked about is an important prep for me. If I'm pulled into a conversation, and if you're the one instigating the conversation, you've already had this opportunity to reflect on why you're doing it, what's your motivation, what you hope to get out of it, and the first 30 seconds sets that stage. The person that you're having this conversation with deserves the respect of being able to calibrate for themselves that same engagement posture that, okay, Michelle's wanting to have this conversation with me. She's probably already thought about what it is she wants to talk about and why. And she's already she's got herself ready. How does Michelle respect my need to be ready to meet her where she's at in this conversation? And I think that's an important thing that we've talked about. Are we easy to listen to? This is now about the engagement. Knowing, so if I come in and it's all on the up and up and it's all good and such, what is it I can do to help you be prepared to engage in the conversation with the same consideration?
I think it depends on the nature of the conversation, right? I may not need to be prepared at all, but if it's something that may warrant, the person might need some time to think about, they might need to go think about their own evidence that they have. That first 30 seconds could be something like, hey, Carla, I want to talk to you about that meeting we had the other day and where you might be able to do better next time. And I may give you some examples of some stuff. When do you want to have that conversation? So I can give you time to think about it. Mm-hmm. Or I can just say, hey, my intent of this conversation is, I think intent is a stated skill. I'm going to have this conversation with you, and this is my intent. I would like to give you some feedback for your consideration for the next time you have that presentation. And you might be, okay, cool, let's go. Versus, I have some feedback I want to give you. You know, and my intent is I want to make you look like an idiot because you did a really bad job.
Bad job.
Versus, I want to help you do better next time. So just even in that scenario, that first 30 seconds makes a big difference. I want to help you do better next time versus that sucked.
Yeah.
And don't do that again. You're going to enter that conversation as the receiver of that message very differently. So when I say the first 30 seconds mm-hmm. really dictates the result,
yeah.
Think about the words that you use. Words change worlds. And entering that conversation can really impact the results you get from that conversation. Huh. But always give the person an opportunity. If they're not ready to have that conversation, unless it's an emergency, then give them the time that they need. And you may have to set a boundary around that or set an expectation around that says we need to have this conversation by the end of the day, or we need to have that conversation by noon, and then let that person follow up. But
and this is true whether in business, personal.
It's life.
Yes. Yes. So I appreciate being able to just recognize that there are two people at least involved, and respecting both of them engaging in that first 30 seconds is a key piece to thinking about what is your intent.
Yeah, and I think that another really critical piece of that is being curious, because I've probably come into the conversation with my own assumptions. I know why you did what you did. I think I know why you did what you did. I should say. I might think I know. But you want to come in and be curious and come in with some level of open-mindedness and curiosity to get your side of the story. I have crafted my assumptions. I've crafted my story. I've made that judgment. We're humans. It's what we do. I could be right. I could be wrong. Let's test that theory and have that conversation from a place of curiosity, not a place of, haha, gotcha.
Mm-hmm. And you bring up open-mindedness as well, not just to what the other person may have to share in this conversation, but to what we've already talked about for self, which is what are the assumptions, what are the expectations, what are the stories, or the story that is driving me right now, being open-minded to that and then receptive to maybe some evidence that's going to contradict this story that you've gotten so comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about getting into a conversation, there's a lot more than voices going back and forth. There's emotion and there's triggers that all of these things that we've been talking about that are elements of leaning in. So conversation is not just simple sharing of words. There's so much more.
It leaves a lasting imprint on people.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And then the other thing, just to close that out, is depending on the conversation, you may have to have a level of empathy and vulnerability in that conversation, depending on what the topic is. And if it's an emotional conversation, really lean into your own ability to be vulnerable and have empathy for the other person. I think that's important when we're thinking about important conversations.
You want to care enough to care. And you should be able to start a conversation with that in mind.
Yeah.
If it's important enough to have this conversation, then it's important enough for me to lean in and invite you to lean in.
Yes.
And to care enough to care. Because after all, the exchange, you're never going to get that time back. You can't unsay things. There's no unscrambling the egg when you shoot from the hip with the story that you've been comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
So know your intention. Know what motivates you. Because as you say,
words change worlds.
I'm Carla.
I'm Doc Shelley. We'll see you next time. You really want to think about when you're entering into a conversation, what's that first 30 seconds going to look like? Because that will pretty much dictate the results you get out of that conversation.